It was a quiet afternoon, one of those afternoons where everything seemed deceptively calm. Brian sat on the couch, mindlessly flipping through TV channels, but his thoughts were miles away. He'd noticed changes in his wife Linda's behavior for months now, changes that gnawed at him like a persistent itch. Lately, she'd been leaving for work earlier and coming home much later, always glued to her phone with whispered conversations and sly smiles she barely tried to hide. When he asked, she would shrug it off, saying it was just work or catching up with friends. But Brian knew better. Something was off. Linda was in the bedroom, packing for a girls' trip she'd been talking about for weeks. The unease in Brian's gut was now impossible to ignore. He sat up, listening to the faint sounds of her moving between the closet and the suitcase, his mind racing. "Are you sure you need to go on this trip?" Brian asked, his voice betraying his worry as he leaned against the doorframe. The question had been nagging him for days, but he hadn't wanted to seem paranoid. Now, though, he couldn't keep it inside any longer. Linda didn't look up from her suitcase. "Brian, we've been over this already. I need some time away," she replied flatly, almost as if she had rehearsed the line. "Time to clear my head." "A whole week, though?" Brian pressed, his voice tight. "You've never gone away like this without me. Not for this long." Finally, Linda turned to face him, her eyes cold. "I'm an independent woman, Brian. I don't need your permission to take a trip with my friends. You're not my keeper." The word stung. Brian felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Starting another argument wouldn't solve anything, not now. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back. "Just be safe, okay?" Linda rolled her eyes, returning to her packing. Brian wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that his fears were just a product of his imagination. But as he watched her move back and forth, something caught his eye that made his heart drop. In the corner of the suitcase, tucked beneath a pile of clothes, was a sexy police officer costume, complete with a badge, handcuffs, and a hat. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd pack for a simple girls' trip. "What the fuck, Linda?" Brian's voice erupted, sharp and filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. His pulse quickened as he stared at the incriminating outfit. "Why do you have that?" Linda glanced up, momentarily startled, but quickly recovered with a smug grin. "Oh, this," she said, pulling the costume out and holding it up as if it were nothing. "It's just for fun. The girls and I are going to have a little party." The sight of it made Brian's blood boil. His fists clenched, his body shaking with a rage he hadn't known he was capable of. "If you take one step out of this house with that," he growled, his voice low and dangerous, "I swear to God, Linda, I'll break your legs." Linda let out a cold, mocking laugh that sent chills down Brian's spine. "Shut up, Brian. Don't try to control me. I told you, I'm an independent woman. I can do whatever I want." She reached into the cupboard and pulled out an extra-large rubber, waving it in his face with a twisted grin. "By the way, my lover is already waiting for me outside." Brian's world collapsed in an instant. Every doubt, every suspicion came crashing down on him with brutal clarity. The betrayal was more than he could bear. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with a blinding rage that seared through his veins. Without a word, Brian stormed out of the bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He practically flew down the stairs, flinging open the front door with such force that it banged against the wall. And there he was, Linda's lover, leaning casually against his car, a cigarette dangling from his lips, as if he had no care in the world. "You!" Brian roared, his voice thick with fury as he crossed the lawn in a few quick strides. Before the man could react, Brian grabbed him by the collar, yanking him towards the house with a force that made the cigarette fall from his lips. "Hey, what the hell?" the man stammered, struggling in Brian's iron grip. But Brian wasn't listening. He dragged the man inside, slamming the door shut behind them. In a swift, brutal motion, he shoved him onto the living room floor. Linda, hearing the commotion, came running down the stairs, her face a mask of shock. "Brian, stop it. What the hell are you doing?" But Brian didn't respond. His vision was clouded with rage, his mind a swirling vortex of betrayal and pain. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not Linda, And not this bastard. This was the moment where everything changed, and Brian knew there was no turning back. The house echoed with sounds of struggle as Brian unleashed his fury. He had the man pinned on the floor, fists striking down with a force he didn't know he possessed. Each punch was a release, a brutal catharsis of the pain and betrayal that had been festering inside him for months. The man beneath him gasped, trying to shield himself, but Brian's rage was unstoppable, a violent storm with no end in sight. Linda's screams filled the air as she rushed to pull Brian off her lover, her hands grabbing at his shoulders in a desperate attempt to stop him. "Brian, stop. Please, stop it." Brian shook her off with a snarl, his eyes wild with anger. "You think you can come into my house, sleep with my wife, and get away with it?" He spat, each word laced with venom. "You think I'm just going to let you walk out of here?" The man was barely able to speak, his words coming out in broken gasps. "Please. I didn't know. I didn't. Shut up." Brian roared, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a sickening thud. The man's head snapped to the side, and he fell silent, the fight beaten out of him. Linda was sobbing now, her voice shrill and panicked. "Brian, you're going to kill him. Please stop." Brian paused, his chest heaving as he looked down at the man crumpled on the floor, his face a bloodied mess. But the sight didn't bring him any satisfaction. It wasn't enough. This wasn't the revenge he had envisioned, the kind that would truly make them pay. He needed something more, something that would make them feel the depth of his pain. He turned to Linda, his eyes cold and devoid of any warmth. "You think you're in control, Linda? You think you can do whatever you want without consequences?" His voice was low, a dangerous calm that made her blood run cold. Linda backed away, fear flashing in her eyes as she tried to reason with him. "Brian, don't do something you'll regret. Please, we can talk about this." Brian's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing kind in it. "Oh, I won't regret this. Not for a second." He grabbed her wrist, dragging her towards the bedroom where her half-packed suitcase lay open on the bed. Without a word, he yanked the sexy police officer costume from the suitcase and thrust it into her hands. "Put it on," he ordered, his voice like ice. Linda stared at him in disbelief, her voice trembling. "What? Are you insane?" Brian's grip on her wrist tightened, his eyes darkening. "Put it on, or I swear to God, Linda, you'll regret it." Tears streamed down Linda's face as she realized there was no escaping this. She had never seen Brian like this before, never imagined he could be so cruel. Her hands shook as she slowly unbuttoned her blouse and slipped into the costume. She could barely see through her tears as she fumbled with the buttons, her mind reeling with fear and regret. She fastened the belt, adjusted the hat, and finally looked at Brian, her voice a broken whisper. "Brian, please." But Brian's expression was unreadable as he watched her. When she was finished, he nodded towards the living room. "Go sit with your lover. Wait for the police." Linda's eyes widened in horror. "The police? What are you talking about?" Brian didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the phone and dialed the emergency number. His eyes never left Linda's as he spoke to the dispatcher, his voice calm and steady. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at my home. My wife and her affair partner are here. I think you'll want to see this." When he hung up the phone, the silence in the room was deafening. Linda looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Brian, please, don't do this. We can work this out. Just don't do this." But Brian was done listening. He was done with the lies, the betrayal, and the pain. He walked past Linda and the beaten man on the floor, heading for the door. He grabbed the suitcase he had packed earlier, knowing that this moment would come, and paused at the threshold. "I'm taking everything, Linda," he said coldly, his back to her. "The money, the house, the inheritance, all of it. You've lost everything, and you'll never see me again." Linda's sobs filled the room as she collapsed onto the floor, her hands covering her face. She had thought she was in control, that she could do whatever she wanted and Brian would always be there, always forgive her. But now, she realized how wrong she had been. She had lost everything, and there was no going back. As Brian stepped outside, he could already hear the distant wail of sirens growing louder. He didn't look back as he got into his car and drove away. The night was dark, the road ahead stretching into the unknown. But for the first time in months, Brian felt a cold sense of satisfaction settle over him. He had done what he needed to do. He had taken back control, and in the process, he had ensured that Linda and her lover would pay for their betrayal. The image of Linda, dressed in that ridiculous costume, trying to explain herself to the police, brought a grim smile to his face. It wasn't just about the revenge. It was about making sure she would never forget this night, that she would never forget what she had done. As the sirens faded into the distance behind him, Brian kept driving. He didn't know where he was going, and he didn't care. All he knew was that he was free. Free from the lies, free from the betrayal, and free from the life he had once thought was his future. And as he drove into the night, the cold, brutal satisfaction stayed with him, a reminder that he had taken back his life, and that he would never let anyone take it from him again. Brian didn't slow down until he reached the airport. The hum of the car engine faded as he turned off the ignition and stepped out. He moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty parking garage. Inside, the airport buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind. But Brian didn't let himself dwell on that. He had a plan, and he needed to execute it perfectly. He approached the ticket counter with a calm demeanor, his mind replaying every detail of the past hour. Linda's tear-streaked face, her lover's muffled groans of pain on the living room floor, and the cold, methodical way he had packed his suitcase for the last time. It all felt like a dream, surreal yet vividly clear. He had known, even before confronting Linda, that something was wrong, and now, his suspicions had been confirmed in the most brutal way possible. When it was his turn at the counter, Brian handed over his passport without hesitation. "One-way ticket," he said, his voice steady, "to the Caribbean. Anywhere quiet." The agent glanced at him, perhaps sensing something off, but didn't ask questions. A few keystrokes later, she handed him the ticket. "Your flight leaves in an hour," she informed him. Brian nodded, taking the ticket and moving away from the counter. He had already taken care of everything, transferring funds, closing accounts, and leaving no loose ends. He had known this day might come, and he was ready. As he walked towards the security checkpoint, he felt an odd sense of calm settle over him. His life as he knew it was over, but in a strange way, that realization brought him peace. He cleared security and found his gate. The waiting area was sparsely populated, a few weary travelers scattered among the rows of seats. Brian chose a spot by the window, looking out at the runway. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, slowly merging with the darkness as the night deepened. The weight of what he had done should have been overwhelming, but instead, all Brian felt was a sense of closure. His marriage, once the center of his world, was gone, shattered by betrayal. But in its place, he had found something new, a chance to start over. Boarding was called, and Brian joined the line, his mind drifting back to the final moments at the house. He had walked out without a second glance, leaving Linda to face the consequences of her actions. She had thought she was in control, but in the end, it was Brian who had the last word. As he settled into his seat on the plane, Brian stared out the window, watching the city below as the plane lifted off. The lights grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the night. He knew there would be fallout, questions, and perhaps even investigations. But that was for another time, another life. For now, he was free. The plane ascended, and with it, Brian's thoughts drifted away from the past. His future was unwritten, a blank slate in a place where no one knew his name, and that was exactly what he needed. The turbulence of his life had come to an end, and as he flew towards the horizon, all he could feel was relief. The island greeted Brian with a warmth that felt almost surreal to the cold, calculated life he had left behind. The villa he rented wasn't anything luxurious, but it was perched perfectly on the beach, where the soft, golden sands met the turquoise waters. It was here, far removed from the chaos and betrayal, that Brian began the arduous task of rebuilding his life. Each morning, Brian awoke to the soothing rhythm of the waves. The sound was like a balm to his soul, washing away the residual anger that had once consumed him. His days were simple, structured almost like a ritual to keep his mind from wandering back to darker times. He would take a swim in the clear, cool water, feeling the weight of the past slip away with each stroke. The ocean became his confessional, a place where he could leave his sins and emerge, if not cleansed, then at least lighter. In the afternoons, Brian often wandered the island, discovering hidden trails that wound through dense, tropical forests. He met the locals, people who had lived on the island all their lives, and who welcomed him with the kind of warmth that he hadn't felt in years. They didn't pry into his past or ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. They were content to let him be, offering a friendly wave or a shared meal, and in return, he found solace in their company. He spent quiet evenings on the porch of his villa, a book in hand and a glass of rum by his side. The sunsets here were spectacular, the sky ablaze with colors that melted into the horizon. As the sun dipped below the water, Brian would allow himself a moment of reflection. The memories of what he had done, the revenge he had exacted, were never far from his mind. But in those peaceful moments, they felt like another life, one that he was slowly, painfully distancing himself from. Yet, as serene as his new life was, the past had a way of creeping in when he least expected it. Sometimes, late at night, when the world was silent except for the rhythmic lapping of the waves, Brian would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and the memories would flood back with an intensity that stole his breath. He could see Linda's tear-streaked face, hear the desperate pleas of her lover, and feel the cold satisfaction that had settled in his chest as he watched them suffer. It was a satisfaction that now made him shudder. The guilt, though dulled by time and distance, was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. It gnawed at him, especially when he saw couples walking hand in hand along the beach, laughing, carefree. Their happiness was a sharp reminder of what he had lost. No, what he had destroyed. There was a time when he and Linda had been like that, before lies and infidelity had torn them apart. Those memories stabbed at his heart, leaving behind a lingering ache that refused to heal. Music was another trigger, bringing back memories with cruel precision. A song would play on the radio, a melody that he and Linda had once danced to, and for a moment, it was as if she were there with him, her head resting on his shoulder, her laughter filling the air. But then the reality would set in, and the pain would rush back, raw and fresh, pulling him into the depths of regret. Brian's life on the island was peaceful, but it was also a reminder that he was hiding, not living. The island was his sanctuary, yes, but it was also a cage, a place where he could escape but not truly move on. He realized that he couldn't stay here forever, living in limbo, haunted by the ghosts of his past. The tranquility of the island was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. He needed closure, a way to confront and accept the darkness that had taken hold of him. And so, after 8 months of isolation, Brian made the decision to return to the mainland. It wasn't an easy choice. The thought of leaving the safety of the island filled him with anxiety, but he knew it was necessary. He couldn't hide forever. To truly begin again, he needed to face what he had done and come to terms with it. Only then could he hope to find peace. As Brian packed his belongings, he took one last look at the villa, the beach, and the ocean that had been his refuge. The island had given him time to heal, but now, it was time to take the next step. He didn't know what awaited him on the mainland, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep running from his past. It was time to face it, once and for all. Brian's return to the mainland felt like stepping into a dream, a world that had moved on without him. The familiar sights and sounds were the same, yet everything felt different, distant, as though he was a ghost drifting through a past life. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind chaos and unanswered questions, but as time passed, the world had forgotten him, absorbed by new scandals and stories. He was no longer the man he once was. That person had been left behind on the island. To avoid drawing attention, Brian took on a new identity. He rented a modest apartment in a quiet part of town, using a false name and paying in cash to remain invisible. The life he once knew was gone, replaced by the anonymity he had chosen. But something had drawn him back to the city. Perhaps it was a need for closure, or maybe it was a subconscious desire to confront the aftermath of his actions. One of his first stops was the old neighborhood. As he drove past the house that had once been his sanctuary, a wave of melancholy washed over him. The house, once vibrant and full of life, now looked neglected. The lawn was unkempt, the paint on the shutters chipped and peeling, and a faded for sale sign stood in the front yard, swaying in the breeze. Seeing it like this, Brian felt a sharp pang of regret, but he quickly buried it. That life was over, and there was no use clinging to the ruins. Unable to sleep one night, Brian took to driving through the city, revisiting places that held memories of his life with Linda. He drove past the restaurant where they had shared their first date, the park where they had picnicked on sunny afternoons, the hotel where they had spent their honeymoon. Each stop brought a flood of memories, some filled with joy, others tinged with bitterness. But all of them were overshadowed by the knowledge of how it had all ended. Finally, he found himself at a small bar on the outskirts of town, a place he had frequented in his younger days. The bar was quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered around. Brian ordered a whiskey and sat at the bar, nursing his drink as he lost himself in thought. The alcohol warmed him, but it did little to chase away the chill of his memories. As he sipped his drink, a tap on his shoulder jolted him from his reverie. Turning, he found himself face to face with someone from his past, Tom, an old friend he hadn't seen in years. "Brian, is that really you?" Tom's voice was thick with disbelief. Brian forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, Tom, it's me. Been a long time." Tom pulled up a stool beside him, his eyes scanning Brian's face with concern. "You look different. What happened to you, man?" Brian let out a dry chuckle. "Life happened." The two men talked for hours, reminiscing about the old days, sharing stories and laughs. But Brian could sense the unspoken questions lingering in Tom's mind. Questions about where he had been, what had happened to his marriage, and why he had disappeared so suddenly. As the night wore on, the conversation turned serious. Tom leaned in, lowering his voice as though afraid of being overheard. "Brian, there's something you need to know. After you left, things got complicated." Brian's heart tightened. "Complicated how?" Tom hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Linda, she's not doing well. After you disappeared, she fell apart. The police got involved, there was an investigation, but nothing came of it. She lost the house, her job, everything. She's been staying with her sister, trying to put the pieces back together." A swirl of emotions swept through Brian. Anger, guilt, satisfaction. He had wanted Linda to suffer, to feel the pain of betrayal as he had, but hearing about her downfall made it all too real. It wasn't the abstract revenge he had imagined. It was a woman's life in ruins, a life he had once loved. "Do you ever think about reaching out to her? Maybe making amends?" Tom's voice was cautious, as if he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Brian stared into his glass, watching the amber liquid swirl. The idea of confronting Linda, of facing the wreckage they had both caused, filled him with dread. "I don't know, Tom. I don't know if I can." Tom nodded, understanding the weight of Brian's words. "It's not easy, man. But maybe it's time to start healing, for both of you." Brian didn't respond. He knew Tom was right, but the path to healing seemed long, dark, and uncertain. As he finished his drink, the reality of his return settled in. He had come back not just to face his past, but to decide what kind of future he wanted. And that, perhaps, was the hardest decision of all. Despite all his doubts, Brian found himself standing outside Linda's sister's house a few days later. Each time he'd driven by, he'd come up with excuses to keep moving, postponing the confrontation he knew was inevitable. But today was different. Today, he couldn't avoid it any longer. He needed answers, closure, something to help him make sense of everything. His hand trembled slightly as he knocked on the door. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, his heart pounding louder with each passing moment. Then, the door slowly creaked open, revealing Linda. She looked different, older, her face etched with the weariness of the past year. The vibrant, confident woman he had once known was now a shadow of her former self. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, words trapped behind the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, Linda broke the silence, her voice soft and hesitant. "Brian, Linda," he replied, his voice rough, thick with emotions he hadn't yet processed. Linda stepped aside, silently inviting him in. The house was modest, far from the comfort and elegance of the home they had once shared, but it was warm and inviting. They moved into the living room, settling onto opposite ends of the couch, the silence between them growing heavier. "I never thought I'd see you again," Linda finally said, her voice wavering as she met his gaze. There was a mix of fear and hope in her eyes, a vulnerability that Brian hadn't seen in her before. "I didn't know if I'd come back," Brian admitted, his voice quiet, "but I had to see you. I had to understand why." Linda lowered her eyes to her hands, which she was nervously twisting in her lap. "I don't have a good answer, Brian. I was selfish. I wanted more than what I had, and I didn't appreciate what we had built. I thought I was in control of everything, but I wasn't. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and I ruined everything." As she spoke, Brian felt the anger he had carried for so long beginning to dissolve, leaving behind a deep, aching sadness. "I know I wasn't perfect either, Linda. I made my share of mistakes. But what you did, it shattered me." Tears filled Linda's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I know. I'm so sorry, Brian. I wish I could take it all back. I would do anything to undo the pain I caused you." They lapsed into silence again, both of them lost in the memories of what had been and what had been lost. The room was filled with the weight of their shared past, the burden of the betrayal that had torn them apart. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now? Do we just go our separate ways?" Brian sighed, leaning back into the worn cushions of the couch. "I don't know, Linda. I came here looking for closure, but I'm not sure that's something I can find. Too much has happened. There's too much damage." Linda nodded, her expression a mix of understanding and sorrow. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me, Brian. I just want you to know how truly sorry I am." They sat there, the silence between them no longer as oppressive, but still heavy with the past. For the first time in a long while, Brian felt a tiny crack in the wall of pain and anger that had surrounded him since that fateful day. It wasn't much, but it was something, an opening, a possibility. "I need time," Brian finally said, his voice steady. "I don't know if we can ever be what we were, but maybe we can find a way to move forward, even if it's separately." Linda managed a small, sad smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'd like that, Brian. I really would." They remained seated, neither ready to say goodbye, yet both knowing that this confrontation, was a necessary step towards whatever came next. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, Brian felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps, with time, they could both find some measure of peace. The days that followed their confrontation were marked by tentative steps toward healing. Brian and Linda navigated an awkward terrain, filled with conversations that reopened old wounds and memories that stirred emotions they had both tried to bury. They weren't trying to rebuild what was lost, but were instead seeking to understand how to live with the scars. At first, their interactions were strained. The weight of their shared past loomed over every word, every glance. They tiptoed around each other, unsure of what to say, afraid of saying too much or too little. But the need to find some form of resolution kept them both engaged, even when it hurt. One afternoon, they sat together on a bench in a quiet park, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. It was the first time in weeks that they had ventured out together, away from the confines of Linda's sister's house. Brian broke the silence, his voice steady but reflective. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Linda. What happened? It changed me." Linda nodded, her eyes on the ground. "I understand, Brian. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm trying to make things right, even if I can't fix what I've done." They sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The past year had taken its toll on both of them, and the path to healing was neither clear nor easy. But there was a mutual acknowledgement that they needed to find a way forward, even if that meant walking separate paths. In the weeks that followed, they continued to meet, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for a walk in the park. The conversations gradually shifted from the painful past to more mundane topics. How Linda was adjusting to her new job, the progress she was making in therapy, Brian's plans for the future. These small talks weren't profound, but they were steps toward normalcy, toward a new kind of relationship that neither had anticipated. Brian found that, with time, the anger that had once consumed him began to dissipate. He realized that holding on to it only kept him chained to the past, preventing him from moving forward. One evening, while sitting on the porch of his new, modest home, he looked out at the setting sun and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't a grand epiphany, but a quiet acceptance that what was done could not be undone, and that was okay. He had confronted his demons, made his amends, and now it was time to live again, free from the shadows that had once darkened his every thought. Linda, too, was finding her own way. The therapy sessions were helping her untangle the mess she had made of her life, and her new job provided a sense of stability. She knew she would never completely undo the hurt she had caused, but she was committed to learning from her mistakes and becoming a better person. Their relationship, though far from what it had been, evolved into something new. They weren't friends in the traditional sense, but they shared a mutual respect and understanding. They had both been through hell and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger in ways they hadn't expected. They were no longer husband and wife, no longer enemies, just two people who had survived and were learning how to live again. And so, life moved on. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was enough. Brian had found a way to let go of the bitterness that had once consumed him, and in doing so, he discovered the peace he had long sought. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that, finally, he was ready to embrace whatever came next.